For the Imperium, spice is used by the navigators of the Spacing Guild to find safe paths between the stars. Without spice, interstellar travel is impossible, making it by far the most valuable substance in the universe.
Smile, Gurney.
I am smiling.
How much will it cost them, traveling all this way for this formality?
3 guild navigators, a total of 1.46 million, 62 salaries round trip.
By the grace of Shaddam IV of House Corino, ascendant to the golden lion throne of Padisha, Emperor of the known universe, I stand before you as herald of the change. We're witnessed by members of the Imperial Court, representatives of the Spacing Guild, and a sister of the Bene Gesserit. The Emperor has spoken. House Atreides shall immediately take control of Arrakis and serve as its steward. Do you accept?
We are House Atreides. There is no call we do not answer. There is no faith that we betray. The Emperor asks us to bring peace to Arrakis. House Atreides accepts!
Atreides! 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 Atreides!
Welcome out, Janusians, to the second video in our energy series. And this global energy crisis, we want to ask ourselves, how did Western policymakers create this problem that we find ourselves in now in terms of being in an energy deficit? We will be starting a series of videos on global energy policy. While the conflict is certainly contributing to significant energy shortages in Europe, it's our view that we've entered into an era of expensive energy that will last into the next decade. So there's basically 3 factors that are worth mentioning here. One is a lack of investment in the energy complex in general, especially in the hydrocarbon space. A end of the shale revolution in terms of productivity gains. And as we've talked about before, that the world is shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and this is creating tensions and reversing some globalization. So one of the things that you've heard bandied about by our politicians that's become the new truism is, well, this Russo-Ukrainian conflict underscores the need for us to transition at a quicker pace from a carbon-based economy, decarbonize our economy as much as possible so we reduce our reliance on Russia and OPEC. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it turns out that the path towards electric vehicles and transitioning our transportation system to electric vehicles actually, and renewables, flows through China. And if we look at the agenda for our video today, we want to assert that the Western model of energy security is broken. And that's because the West outsourced its energy security and manufacturing to the global South. Environmental, societal governance, as well as policymakers and dysfunctional politics have contributed towards bad energy policy. and we have had some inaction in some of segments of our energy market that are going to end up being problematic for us as we're heading towards a multipolar world. Now, what do we mean by the global north versus the global south? So the global north is the collection of OECD members, are essentially the rich countries or richest countries in the world, and add Australia into that mix. And the global south are the developing economies and rising powers like the BRICS. Recall that we've been talking about it since the beginning of our video, the fact that the global financial and trade system are run with the US dollar as the reserve currency, and that the US effectively provides a network and payment system for the world and for energy producers. Of course, the U.S. also, as the single global superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union, has also essentially provided security for trade routes and made sure that the oceans carriers are able to sail safely, and global trade is able to be conducted safely through the various choke points around the world. Now, Europe, of course, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been moving towards itself. The European Union has been integrating, and at the same time, they're becoming ever more reliant on Russian and natural gas. In particular, of course, we've highlighted that Germany has half of its economy is reliant on natural gas in the previous video. Now, the movement towards integration with Russia in terms of its dependency on Europe's dependency on natural gas reached its peak in the 2000s when Nord Stream 1 was completed. And we discussed Nord Stream 2 in the last video. We can see that Europe sources over 40% of its natural gas imports from Russia. So they've become very dependent on Russian natural gas. Now, Trump issued a warning to Germany saying that this over-reliance on Russia would come back in the future to haunt them, and was mocked by a German delegation while he was making that speech.
When Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia, where you're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia. So we're protecting Germany, we're protecting France, we're protecting all of these countries. And then numerous of the countries go out and make a pipeline deal with Russia, where they're paying billions of dollars into the coffers of Russia. So we're supposed to protect you against Russia, but they're paying billions of dollars to Russia, and I think that's very inappropriate. And the former chancellor of Germany is the head of the pipeline company that's supplying the gas.
Of course, nobody likes to say that anything Trump said was ever correct. 2001, China was granted permanent member status, as we mentioned in the previous video, and that to the World Trade Organization, and that guaranteed that they would have companies that invested there would have tariff certainty. So the Western companies started to plow in there and build manufacturing capacity in China. So there was this massive transfer of labor-intensive work as well as environmentally unfriendly manufacturing to China. And China was able to achieve increase in manufacturing while dramatically increasing its use of coal, which is one of the dirtiest forms of carbon to burn, and of course oil at the same time, while it increased its manufacturing capacity. So in the West, we transitioned our economy to service sector jobs, many of them in finance and in the information technology sector. The Global South then acted as a source of cheap labor, and the West flourished under this situation because we weren't producing real goods, and we didn't have to therefore absorb the environmental costs of the production of those real goods. In fact, Kanye West has a line from Stronger Faster which says, "I ask because I'm not sure, does anybody make real shit anymore?" And that was sort of emblematic of the aughts when this transition was underway. So the ultimate plan was to outsource dirty jobs while focusing on a clean service sector. Now, there's two events that have defined modern environmentalism. One of them, of course, is Fukushima. In 2011, there was a major earthquake off the coast of Japan, and the Japanese city Fukushima had its nuclear power plant destroyed as a consequence of that earthquake, and it released radioactive water into the surrounding communities. Of course, this really powered an even greater anti-nuclear movement that had been present since the 1960s during the Cold War. And of course, there was the nuclear accident in Chernobyl in 1986, which was in the modern day Ukraine. Those two nuclear incidents. There was also an incident at 3 Mile Island in New York that created very bad public sentiment towards nuclear power. Another event that defined modern environmentalism is the 2015 Paris Agreement. It was a landmark agreement that was signed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Pledges were made to achieve net zero emissions, CO2 emissions by 2050. We saw the emergence of Greta Thunberg, a Swedish teenager who became the voice for climate activism for people all over the world, was named Times Person of the Year. There emerged a system of corporate governments called environmental social governance, and this was among its many champions. One of the champions of this movement was Larry Fink, who is a CEO of BlackRock, an investment group that wrote a seminal letter to his investment community in 2018. And he emphasized the importance of environmental preservation and how he would be using these governance techniques to allocate capital going forward. Now, BlackRock was a major player in the investment industry with over $10 trillion of assets under management.
But I would say to you, Andrew, with total clarity and confidence, that finance has caught on to the idea that we need to move forward on sustainability. And I believe we're at the cutting edge of making substantial changes in how we invest, where we invest. And I believe this is going to move sustainability much faster than any of the skeptics ever imagined. And I would say, as you framed the prior question, so many of the skeptics did not even understand so much of what I wrote about last year, and it's happening. We're seeing an acceleration of money moving into more sustainability. We need to create a true carbon market, and that's one thing that I've had many meetings on. How can we create a true quantifiable and certifiable carbon market? And that will address some of the skeptics' issues, but with some of the major people in the world's finance are talking about how do we create a true carbon market, and so we could properly evaluate and price carbon effectively, right. And we could have companies buying and selling carbon offsets, and I think that's a net positive for the world.
Now, traditional finance people like myself, and there's nobody more traditional than Ashwath Darian, who literally wrote the textbook on investing that's used in most business schools in terms of teaching finance and valuation techniques. He's very skeptical of ESG. And he talks about its targets being moving targets. This ESG movement, at least from my perspective, is kind of another marketing attempt by Wall Street to appeal to what we would now call a woke population, which has been indoctrinated from high school up into college levels with climate alarmism. And we're going to talk about that momentarily. Demirdan points out that two of Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Gazprom, were ESG compliant just until the invasion. And so we've got lots of ESG companies that are compliant in just change the parameters as to what is ESG compliant based on the convenience of our shifting needs are as a society. And so he doesn't view it as a seriously thoughtful measurement system. And neither do I, for that matter. And I think it's actually been destructive with respect to energy investments in the West, or the global North, as we've been calling it in this video. If we want to talk about the environment, we have to, first of all, talk about some baselines. And I take my nod in terms of my understanding of climate change from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC for short. This organization is considered the gold standard of scientific consensus on climate change. And they've done various assessments where they aggregate and synthesize the climate change research that's out there. And it's not a perfect system, but it's the one that's recognized as, because there are some contradictory perspectives in different volumes. But the most current completed assessment is Assessment 5. We're still waiting for assessment. Much of Assessment 6 has been completed, but the summary report is not out there yet for Assessment 6. And so when I think of climate change, I think of the IPCC assessment reports and various reports that they do. Now, the IPCC report, I think it's fair to say, is accepted scientific canon, or at least an aggregation of a canon that represents an aggregation of accepted scientific research. So the problem that we have with the interpretations that we get in the media and around where much of public policy has been focused lately, and where environmentalist groups have focused, is they've focused on looking at where the modeling is the most extreme. So they go to discussions are centered around, well, what happens when the Earth heats up by 5 degrees and or there's no efforts made to improve as we go along. There is a Lex Friedman video in the show notes where there's a discussion on modern environmental policies, and I encourage you to watch that video. It's quite long, and a thorough discussion of this topic is sort of beyond the purview of what we can do in this video. We've kind of gotten to a point in society where we're suggesting that the world is coming to an end. Some have suggested literally that the world is going to end in 2035 if we don't take some immediate climate change actions.
Millennials and people, and Gen Z and all these folks that come after us are looking up, and we're like, The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it?
And this climate alarmism that has permeated the public discussion has been counterproductive to the formation of policy and to the understanding that people have going out there. Now, there's a Nature article that points this out. The level of emissions are going to somewhere take us towards a 1.5 to 2.5 degree increase. This is the expected, but often we get worst case scenarios presented to us in the media that talk about levels of emissions where it's just assumed that we're going to continue on with ourselves as business as usual. If we go to the IPCC itself and we go to section 10.9.5, let me quote directly from assessment 5. In sum, estimates of the aggregate economic impact of climate change are relatively small, but with a large downside risk. Estimates of incremental damage per ton of carbon dioxide emitted vary by 2 orders of magnitude. So when we look at the estimated economic costs of the temperature going up 2%, those economic costs are not expected to be high, but there is significant down risk in the tails, like small percentage risks of higher economic cost events. What's more, if we look at the research, we can understand that actually weather-related deaths, because we've gotten richer as a society, have been declining for over 100 years. So a lot of things that in these extreme views get forgotten is that as we get richer, we're able to afford mitigation techniques. We're able to afford things where we can, if temperatures get hotter, we can afford air conditioning. We can afford infrastructure build-outs. Most of the costs right now of climate change, again, I cite, go and see the discussion in the Lex Friedman video in the show notes, are around, in fact, people making bad economic decisions on where to build. So building in floodplains seems like perennial floods they have in the United States, where people are building along the Mississippi, which floods out periodically. Bad water use policy in California, where they're using 60 gallons of water for a single almond. So these types of things are effectively creating costs that are accelerating with climate change instead of mitigating those costs.
Was that we're building vulnerability to climate hazards at the same time. So climate is changing, but we're changing too. And where we are here in Austin, Texas is a great example. Flash Flood Alley, named in the 1920s, west of here. Everyone forgot about flash floods, built these huge developments, along these river basins. Then one side starts saying, global warming. And the other side is not recognizing that we built willfully, greedily, vulnerability in places of utter hazard. Same things played out in Pakistan and in Fort Myers, Florida. You start to understand that we're creating a landscape of risk as climate is changing, then it feels, oh my God, that's more complex, right? But it also gives you more action points. It's like, okay, well, we know how to design better. We know that today's coasts won't be tomorrow's coasts.
So this environmental extremism has bred nonsensical policies. For example, we have not relied as much as we should on nuclear power. They were first commercially built in 1954 in the Soviet Union, and nuclear power is suited to get rid of what we call base load electricity generation. And because nuclear power doesn't generate any carbon, it is uniquely positioned to replace coal as a base load technology. And we saw how much coal China still using ever more coal. We're still using more and more coal every year in the world. And if we would rely more on nuclear, especially to replace our baseload electricity generation, we would be able to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. And there's now what we would call small-scale, self-contained nuclear power plants. There's going to be one built in Wyoming in a few years. We need to look to the new generation nuclear technologies to replace coal. Germany, in fact, has fired up more of its coal plants because it has been looking to phase out. It's phased out some of its nuclear plants, which it decided to do after the Fukushima event in 2011. Now, they extended the life of a few of the plants until next year due to the Russo-Ukrainian war. But ironically, it's led to Germany being required to produce, start up old coal plants and generate electricity again through coal. When we're looking at transitioning our energy system and asking ourselves questions about, well, what kind of energy system do we want in the future? And we can agree that we want an energy system in the future that is less carbon intensive, and we want to transition away from that. But we have to, again, if we're looking at the constraints of things like we've got extremely old and limited electricity systems, and we've got limited access to being able to convert our vehicle fleet to EV because of shortages of various metal components. We need to think about this transition period as not being something that gets done in 5 or 10 years, but a project that is where we're looking at maybe 25 years to 30 years in the making. And in the meantime, these policies that have essentially turned the carbon-based energy system into a pariah, particularly on oil, they've caused a huge amount of disinvestment in oil. And so just to keep up with our 100 million barrel a day oil usage in the world, we need $650 to $700 billion a year in investment because oil wells decline in productivity every year. And so as a result, what we've seen is a disinvestment that's happened not only because of ESG and policy changes, but of course we had the price collapse due to the shale boom that we talked about in the last video. But collectively, these circumstances have come to essentially create about half the level of investment since 2014 that would be needed to sustain just our levels of production. And so what's happened is global inventories have fallen, they've been making up for the fact that the supply-demand imbalance has come out of whack, and we've got over $2 trillion of disinvestment over the last 7 years in the fossil fuel industry. And that, of course, since oil goes into the production of everything, means that we're going to that it's hugely inflationary to the global economy and is going to potentially create the problems that we talked about in the last video. Now, it's not just us that are pointing out that the investment environment is such that ESG and the political environment around oil, when politicians are promising to kill oil. How do you make a long-term investment? A lot of these oil wells, you're investing lots of money. Sometimes in the case of the oil sands, you might invest $1 billion and hope to recover it with decent prices over the space of, say, 30 to 40 years. And so if you look at both surveys that have been done in Canada and the United States, in the US, there's the Dallas Fed and the Bank of Canada here in Canada, they both show that oil companies are wary of making further investments because they are because of the current investment climate. And again, the oil industry itself lost lots of money last decade, lost $550 billion, and so this year the focus has been on the profits in the oil industry. But last decade, they were the single biggest sector in terms of losses in the U.S. economy, $550 billion. And investors are wary now of making further long-term commitments to oil supply when we're in an environment where governments are trying to either constrain infrastructure, do wealth taxes, do lots of policies which essentially are punitive to the investment returns of the oil industry. So there's also a level of schizophrenia around this now as governments are starting to come into awareness of their energy deficit. So we had a UK fracking ban that was introduced in 2019, and then Liz Truss, in her 2 seconds that she was the Prime Minister of England, of the UK, that she lifted the ban. Then when Sunak came back in, he reinstated the ban. Development of energy assets of carbon-based energy assets in the West has been hugely disincentivized. In Germany itself, they've got quite a bit of potential for shale gas, but they have fracking in Germany is a non-starter. So they do not have the political will for this. So again, we've had this sort of crazy policy response to an energy crisis that we have created. Windfall taxes in the UK and Europe. So if you're taking profits from a company, by definition, they have less money to invest and less incentive to invest in further supply in an era where supply is tight. We are talking about a price cap on Russian oil. Well, if Russia withdraws some of its oil from the market, it's promised not to send oil to those who want to enforce the price cap. That means that even if they get that oil indirectly and they start playing political games like Europe wants to do, where they're going to, buy an oil tanker from China that's got its oil from Russia, it's creating more costs. Banning internal combustion engines and to the green economy, and all of this while we are starting to acknowledge that the biggest geopolitical threat is effectively China. And so we see tensions rising between Canada and China, United States and China, and at the same time, we're trying to transition in the midst of a carbon energy crisis, particular, but nuclear also. We're trying to transition towards more dependency on our energy from China in this case. And so if we look at and compare the level of manufacturing in the world from 1991 to 2020, we can see that China has come to become the manufacturing superpower. And so we, right now, we don't make stuff in the West. We have a service-based economy, and if we want to get away from this reliance on China and Russia, it's not going to happen overnight because we've already set up a global supply chain that is heavily dependent on the Middle East and Russia for energy and on China for manufacturing. Really, if you think about it, a lot of these policies, if you're isolating Russia, if you are threatening to put a price cap on Russian oil, it puts OPEC, the rest of OPEC, the OPEC organization, in an awkward position with respect to its relationship to the West, because it knows that someday it may come in the crosshairs of Western disapproval for something, and that tool may be used to threaten or manipulate or hurt them. And so these price cap measures have, in effect, forced the Middle East, OPEC, Russia, and China to act in a more coordinated fashion. And it puts us at a disadvantage because we're kind of forcing a marriage. If you want to create weakness, you'd like to create strategic differences, not strategic commonalities with respect to these various things. So our next video is going to be on our suggested policy solutions to the energy crisis. That's it for now. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Well, the trilemma is to explain the nature of the trade-offs of these three things: hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democracy. You can have at most two out of those three. You cannot have all three of them simultaneously. So if you want to enhance globalization, you have to decide whether you're going to give up some sovereignty or going to give up some on democracy. That's the nature of the trade-offs. Well-functioning markets always are embedded in a range of institutions that are largely these days provided by governments. The challenge that globalization poses, if you're going to have this global market, who is going to provide those institutional underpinnings? In the 19th century, an earlier era of globalization, countries like Britain and the United States effectively enforced the rights of investors and ensured the free flow of capital around the world. The moment that the golden straitjacket came into conflict with a system of greater democratic participation, in particular of the labor movement, those rigid rules were no longer compatible with this new phase of politics. So we historically moved to a different period, what I called here the Bretton Woods Compromise, the period after the Second World War, where Keynes said we need to have a regime that's going to combine a national sovereignty with democratic politics. And that required essentially keeping hyperglobalization at bay. Of course, it's entirely possible to imagine a third possibility, one way that we can combine democracy with hyperglobalization, where essentially we have the global federalist equivalent of a United States of America. Now, of course, that seems a very far-fetched notion. In some people's minds, this is, for example, what Europe is about. It's creating a kind of quasi-federalism. The troubles that the Eurozone are going through today derive from this trilemma.